the empire of precision. Before the war began, Germany was an engineer's paradise. Factories gleamed with order, tools were lined up like soldiers, machines moved with rhythm, precise, silent, proud. The German worker didn't just build, he crafted. Every bolt, every gauge, every piston was measured like art. To the Reich, this wasn't just industry, it was identity. They saw efficiency as a virtue, precision as purity. They built not for speed, but for perfection. And in that perfection, they believed they'd found superiority. German propaganda made sure everyone saw the contrast. While Americans built in chaos, shouting foremen, assembly lines, untrained hands, Germany built in harmony. One nation obsessed with mass, the other with mastery. To Hitler, it was simple. Democracies were weak because they were disorganized. He said it often. Freedom breeds confusion. He saw debate as decay, compromise as cowardice. And in his mind, a system that allowed women to work, workers to strike, and politicians to argue could never build an empire. In the 1930s, that illusion seemed true. Germany's war industry rose like clockwork. Messerschmitts, Panzers, U-boats, all built by hand, inspected by engineers in white coats. Their craftsmanship was unmatched, but so was their arrogance. They mistook discipline for destiny. They believed that order itself could win wars, that mechanized perfection could conquer noisy freedom. And when their factories turned to weapons, they saw themselves as gods of steel, reshaping the world with precision. But they didn't understand the chaos they mocked. Because in that chaos, in those messy, loud, democratic factories across the ocean, something was stirring. A power far greater than perfection. A power born not from obedience, but from belief. The Reich had built its empire on control. Democracy was about to build one on momentum. And when the storm came, it wouldn't march in silence, it would roar. The mess of democracy. Across the Atlantic in the late 1930s, America didn't look like an empire at all. It looked tired. Factories stood half empty, unemployment lines stretched around corners, and newspapers debated whether the next war was even worth fighting. Inside Detroit's auto plants, men built cars, not tanks. They joked about Europe's madness, about Hitler's tantrums, never imagining their own machines would soon face his. To the world, America seemed distracted, too divided, too talkative, too democratic. Even when the storm clouds gathered in Europe, Washington bickered. Isolationists warned against war. Union leaders fought over hours and pay. Newspapers mocked Roosevelt's warnings. And to Berlin, it was proof that democracies would always crumble under their own noise. But what the Reich didn't see was the hidden power in that noise. Because democracy doesn't move fast until it does. When it turns completely. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The day that turned a divided nation into a single engine. Factories that once built Fords and Chevrolets were ordered to build tanks, bombers, and bullets. Civilian industry was nationalized overnight. The same workers who once fought over wages now raced to outproduce death itself. There were no grand speeches in the factories, only sparks, sweat, and steel. Men and women worked through nights. Car companies built airplanes. Refrigerator plants made machine guns. And America discovered its greatest weapon wasn't a general, it was production. German spies couldn't understand it. How could a country so loud, so undisciplined, so chaotic, outbuild an empire that had planned every detail? They didn't know that democracy's strength comes not from silence but from sound, from 1,000 voices working toward one purpose, from a freedom that once threatened becomes unstoppable. Within a year, the mess of democracy had become the mightiest factory floor the world had ever seen. Assembly lines moved day and night, trains carried mountains of steel, engines of freedom thundered from coast to coast. The Reich had laughed at America's chaos. Soon they would learn that chaos, when fueled by conviction, builds faster than tyranny ever could. The factories that woke up. When America woke up, it didn't do so quietly. It awoke like thunder. In 1942, Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy speech wasn't just a promise, it was a command. Every factory, every field, every machine became a weapon. Within months, the sound of hammers replaced silence. Sparks lit the night sky. The same hands that once built the comforts of peace now built the machinery of survival. Automakers turned to armor. Ford's River Rouge plant began producing a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes, a plane that once took months to build. General Motors built tanks, Chrysler built shells, and refrigerator companies made gun barrels. America didn't just mobilize, it reinvented itself. And it wasn't just men. Women flooded the factories, mothers, wives, sisters, stepping into roles once unthinkable. They built engines, welded hulls, and loaded ammunition belts by hand. Rosie the Riveter wasn't propaganda, she was reality. The factory floor became the new front line. Germany's spy network sent back frantic reports. America's industrial capacity is beyond imagination. What they didn't understand was that this wasn't just manufacturing, it was meaning. Every bolt tightened, every wing riveted, every crate shipped across the Atlantic carried more than metal. It carried resolve. The Reich believed efficiency could replace humanity, but here, it was humanity that built efficiency. Ordinary people working together, not because they were ordered to, but because they believed in something bigger. By 1943, America produced more war material than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. The lazy democracy had outpaced the efficient empire. The factories that were once mocked as chaotic had become the beating heart of the free world. The war was no longer just a fight of soldiers, it was a race of engines. And in that race, democracy was accelerating faster than tyranny could comprehend. The arsenal of the free. In the heart of Detroit, a new kind of war machine was being born, one forged not by conquest, but by cooperation. It wasn't just a city anymore, it was a sound. The steady rhythm of presses, the hum of conveyors, the heartbeat of liberty echoing through steel. They called it the arsenal of democracy. And it wasn't a metaphor, it was the most powerful industrial miracle in history. Factories operated 24 hours a day. At the Willow Run plant, 40,000 workers assembled bombers under a single roof. In one corner of America, a farmer's daughter welded tail sections. In another, a steel worker shaped the nose. When those pieces met, they became a weapon that crossed oceans. Germany couldn't comprehend it. Their factories were centralized, controlled, militarized, every step approved by officers, every worker watched. In America, chaos ruled, but it was organized chaos. Innovation happened on the fly. If something broke, a worker fixed it. If production lagged, a manager improvised. That freedom, the freedom to adapt, became the single greatest weapon of all. The assembly line, once seen as ordinary, became divine. Engines roared into life by the thousands. Tanks rolled off lines so fast they barely cooled before shipping. Planes were painted, tested, and flown straight to the warfront. The world had never seen anything like it, and it terrified the Reich. Because in every rivet, in every roar of machinery, Germany saw a reflection of what it lacked, unity born of belief, not fear. By 1944, Allied logistics had turned the tide. Each landing craft on D-Day, each bomber over Berlin, each ration box in the trenches could trace its lineage to a factory floor in Michigan, Ohio, or Pennsylvania. Every one was a victory, stamped in steel, made in the USA. Democracy's factories had stopped laughing. They were now roaring, and soon, those roars would echo over the cities that once mocked them. The assembly line versus the master race. The Reich believed in superiority, not just of people, but of parts. Every German weapon was built to perfection. Tanks were hand-assembled, aircraft meticulously tuned. To them, war was an art form, crafted by masters, fought by elites. The panzer crews mocked the crude shapes of American tanks. German engineers scoffed at the stamped steel of the Sherman, calling it a tractor in uniform. And for a while, they were right. The Tiger tank could destroy a Sherman from over a mile away. Its armor was thicker, its gun longer, its engine stronger. But there was one problem. It needed fuel, time, and flawless precision to even exist. The Americans didn't build perfection, they built presence. They built thousands, then tens of thousands. Where the Reich built masterpieces, America built momentum. The Sherman tank wasn't a symbol of weakness, it was a symbol of scale. It was easy to repair, easy to replace, and built to move. A German Tiger might destroy 5 Shermans, but for every Tiger that rolled off the line, 5 more Shermans were already waiting to roll in. The assembly line became America's secret weapon. In Detroit, the Ford plant at Highland Park turned out tanks the way it once made Model Ts. In California, aircraft rolled out of factories like cars down a street. Every screw, every plate, every engine was standardized, interchangeable, predictable, reliable. The Reich had no word for mass production. Their pride refused it. But mass production doesn't care about pride, it cares about victory. The same democracy that Hitler mocked as mechanical chaos had found its power in the very thing the Reich despised, repetition. And that repetition became rhythm, a rhythm so loud it drowned out the sound of precision itself. By 1944, Germany's factories couldn't keep up. Their tanks grew heavier, their machines slower, their logistics thinner. While Hitler chased perfection, Roosevelt chased progress, and progress won. The assembly line had defeated the master race, not with art, but with numbers. Because in the end, war doesn't reward beauty, It rewards endurance, the machines that learn to breathe. By the middle of the war, America's factories no longer needed rest. They had become living things, breathing, thundering, unstoppable. Steam rose from rooftops like breath from an army of giants. The sound of presses, welders, engines, and drills blended into a single voice, the voice of freedom at work. Shift changes blurred into each other. Lights never turned off. In Willow Run, workers joked that the factory didn't know what night was anymore. In Pittsburgh, furnaces glowed like sunsets that never ended. From the Gulf to the Great Lakes, railways trembled under the weight of war material. Each day, America built more than Germany could dream of in a month. But this wasn't just industry, it was imagination. Democracy doesn't move by command, it moves by creation. And on those factory floors, innovation was constant. Workers found ways to weld faster, conserve metal, and reduce waste. Factories shared blueprints freely, competing not for profit, but for victory. The result was terrifying to the Reich. Machines that once required hours of assembly were now produced in minutes. A single American plant could outproduce an entire German industrial region. And because America had the oil, the coal, the manpower, and the will, there was no ceiling. Meanwhile, in Germany, the lights were going out, fuel convoys were cut off, workers starved, bombs fell daily. Factories that once ran on perfection now ran on fear. They had machines, but not the freedom to use them. America's factories had become something beyond mechanical. They had become symbolic. Each engine, each bullet, each ship carried the breath of a nation that refused to be silenced. By 1944, the machines of democracy had taken on a life of their own, not built for conquest, but for continuity. The Reich's empire was shrinking, but the factory lines of freedom, they were expanding, one heartbeat at a time, the sky darkened by steel. By 1943, the sky itself had chosen a side. At dawn, the hangar doors slid open and democracy walked out on wings. Rows of B-17s and B-24s shimmered with frost. Crew ladders clanged, engines coughed to life one by one, until the air vibrated with a single note. Production turned into thunder. They lifted into formation like a city leaving the earth. Hundreds, then thousands. The contrails braided a white handwriting across Europe that spelled the same word over and over, inevitable. On the ground, people shaded their eyes not to count airplanes, but to measure time, how long until the factories they fed would go quiet. This was not elegance, it was endurance with propellers. Factories in Kansas and Washington sent aluminum bones across oceans. Refineries in Texas poured high octane into veins that never ran dry. The bombers were heavy with more than explosives. They were heavy with decisions made in open rooms by elected men and argued over by citizens who could say no and then chose to say go. At first, the Reich believed the sky belonged to it. Its fighters were fast, its pilots lethal, its flak walls thick as forests. But democracies iterate, tyranny repeats. Escort ranges lengthened, drop tanks appeared. Then came the long-legged P-51s, sliding into the formations like wolves taking up guard. The message to the daylight bombers was simple: you won't walk alone anymore. The calendar filled with names that sounded like hammer blows: Big Week, the transportation plan, the oil campaign. Rail lines were severed artery by artery, marshalling yards turned to black chessboards of cratered squares. Refineries bloomed into pillars of flame that wrote their own weather. War isn't won when a bomb lands, it's won when a train doesn't arrive. From cockpit glass, the crews watched Germany shrink into smoke and rails. From kitchens and cellars, civilians watched the myth of invincibility peel away in sheets of soot. The Reich had promised the people an iron sky. Democracy offered them a relentless one, and through it all, the factories back home kept breathing. A bomber lost today returned tomorrow wearing a different serial number but the same purpose. Engines were not mourned, they were replaced. In that math lay the quiet cruelty of freedom, compassion for the person, indifference to the machine. By the winter of 1944, the sky was no longer a battlefield, it was an assembly line overhead, moving in one direction only. Every sortie was a conveyor, every escort a gear. Germany looked up and saw not airplanes but a system, vast, faceless, moral in its momentum. The factories of democracy had learned to fly, and the empire that mocked them measured its remaining days in the shadows they cast. The factories under fire. Tyranny imagines its foundries eternal, but furnaces cool faster than faith, and faith was the first thing the Reich ran out of. The bomb doors opened over more than roofs. They opened over an idea: precision is destiny. Ball-bearing plants that once spun the nation smooth now seized. Synthetic fuel complexes, stitched from chemistry and willpower, folded into twisted pipe and burning ponds. Steelworks that rang like cathedrals at dawn became organs with the wind knocked out. Albert Speer drew new diagrams in deeper ink. Disperse the shops, bury the mills, tunnel the mountains, move the machine tools into forests, school basements, salt mines, replace skilled men with anyone who still breathed, foreign laborers, prisoners in stripes, girls with raw hands and eyes that did not look up. The output graphs jerked, steadied, lied, and then fell again. Sirens reset the workday. A shift might begin at noon and evacuate by 1, resume at 3, dig at 5. Production reports came spattered with plaster dust. Foremen kept wrenches in one pocket and family photos in the other. You cannot schedule excellence under bombardment. You can only survive it. The Reich still built marvels, jets that outran sound's memory, tanks with armor like verdicts. But marvels require margin, spares, fuel, apprenticeship, sleep. The war had audited Germany and found no surplus of anything but rubble. Meanwhile, across an ocean and a continent, the factories democracy ran never heard a siren. Their roofs did not fall in, their children slept. When a gearbox cracked in Michigan, a courier did not sprint through smoke. He signed a form and a replacement arrived before the coffee cooled. Resilience is not mystery, it is distance, paperwork and trust. Under fire, the Reich tried to copy its enemy's scale. It issued targets in millions, quotas in thunder. But quantity cannot be commanded into existence. It must be coaxed by predictability, and predictability cannot live where roofs are temporary. So they printed posters. Work faster, strike harder, 1 more hour for victory. The posters hung by a single tack in walls that shook, then the tack fell and no one bent to pick it up. When the raids paused, Germany walked its own shop floors as if visiting a wounded friend. Men counted machines the way doctors count breaths. This press still aligns, this lathe still runs if you touch the housing here. This crane will lift once more if you beg it. A nation can build on heroism for a season. An industry builds only on routine. In the end, the factory war delivered its verdict, not in speeches but in silences. Silence where turbines had sung. Silence where rail cars once screamed, turning brakes. Silence in the offices where the rulers tallied perfect futures and found only smoke in the margins. Democracy did not win because its machines were sacred. It won because its people were allowed to be ordinary, every day without interruption. A lunch whistle that sounds on time can defeat a myth that shouts forever. And as the dust settled on smashed housings and scorched gantries, the last thing the engineers of the Reich understood was this: they had not been beaten by better parts, but by a better process, the one they laughed at when it was loud, and learned to fear when it would not stop. The collapse of perfection. By early 1945, the Reich's industrial pride, its precision, its order, its obsession with engineered superiority, was no longer a strength. It had become a trap. Factories that once produced world-class machinery now existed inside a shrinking cage of broken rails, empty fuel tanks, and shattered infrastructure. The German industrial miracle had always relied on control, tight schedules, centralized command, skilled artisans, perfect materials. But war doesn't reward control. War rewards resilience. And resilience was something Germany no longer had. Rail lines lay twisted like abandoned snakes. Locomotives rusted on tracks they could no longer traverse. Entire assembly halls stood roofless, open to snow and silence. And the workers, once the pride of Europe, were now exhausted shadows, laboring under shortages so severe they measured effort in hours, not output. The Reich's factories still built machines, but their machines could no longer build war. Tiger tanks rolled out without engines. Jet fighters sat wingless under tarps they'd never escape. Submarines left pens only to run aground for lack of fuel. Perfection, once the empire's boast, had become its burden. A Tiger tank that required 300,000 labor hours could not compete against a Sherman that required 10,000. A jet fighter that needed rare alloys could not compete against piston planes built by the thousands. A system that relied on flawlessly trained craftsmen could not withstand the death or conscription of those craftsmen. By the final months, Germany's engineers stood amid ruins, reviewing broken blueprints with trembling hands. They were men who once believed perfection would protect them, now staring at machines too advanced to maintain, too fragile to fuel, too complex to matter. In one of his last speeches, Albert Speer admitted the truth. We have been outproduced, not by better ideas, but by a greater idea. Behind him was the rubble of a factory that once symbolized a nation's dreams. Now it symbolized its arrogance. The collapse wasn't a moment. It was a sound. The silence after the last machine stops breathing. The echo of the engines. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world finally heard the echoes. Not of marching boots, not of shouted orders, but of factories that had never stopped. In America, the engines of democracy slowed for the first time in 4 years. Not because they were tired, but because their purpose had changed. Smoke thinned above Detroit. Welders removed their gloves, women hung up their uniforms and returned to classrooms, clinics, and homes that had waited in suspense. But the machines didn't rest for long. The same assembly lines that built tanks now built tractors. The same furnaces that forged shells now forged steel beams for Europe's reconstruction. Liberty ships once loaded with ammunition now carried wheat, cement, tools, medicines. Factories that had won the war now prepared to rebuild the peace. Across the Atlantic, the contrast was unbearable. German industry, once a monument to precision, now lay in ruins, roofless, smokeless, silent. But strangely, this silence wasn't defeat. It was renewal. Under Allied supervision, the ruined factories were cleared, retooled, restarted. And the ironic twist, the cinematic twist, was this. German industry was rebuilt using American principles: mass production, flexible systems, decentralized innovation, worker-driven problem-solving. The very ideas the Reich once mocked as chaotic now became the foundation of its future. The miracle wasn't the machines, it was the mindset. Freedom had outproduced tyranny, and now it would outbuild it. By the 1950s, the same nation whose factories once fueled conquest had become one of the world's economic engines, powered by democracy, not dictatorship. The echo of American engines had crossed the ocean, entered a broken world, and restarted it. In the quiet truth of post-war Europe, one lesson stood tall: machines built by free people will always outlast machines built for forced purpose, because tyranny builds for power, democracy builds for possibility, and possibility is the only engine that never stops.